Thank you.
Wel, noswaith dda i gyd, a croeso, a diolch yn fawr am ddod yma. Welcome to you all, thank you very much for coming. Lovely evening, and this of course is the first evening of our meeting after the summer holidays, and the first one for us for the caster after the summer holidays, so welcome to you all. Now, what I want to point out first of all to you, you can see on there what it's going to be about. Now, I don't want anybody to shout out, where's Robin? Okay, now, because he couldn't come here today because there's something on the A55. Okay, we're going to have to settle with what we've got here. Okay, so for this evening, our topic of conversation, our topic for the evening is the story of the history of the longbow. And who better to tell you all about it? It's not that somebody that was there when they actually made them, but somebody who knows what he's talking about. So I'm not going to pretend to say anything that makes everything look good. This is Mr. Bernard Dennis MBE. Now I'm sure he wouldn't want me to say that, but of course if he got the MBE, he must have got it, he must have deserved it, and rightfully we will give him that homage call of addressing that situation. So without further ado, I want you to give a rapturous applause to Mr. Bernard Dennis. Come on.
Thank you very much, Di, for that introduction. I hope I live up to the occasion. But thank you also for the invitation to come and talk to you this evening about the history of the longbow. This is a fine example of a longbow. And it's made from one piece of yew, but I'll speak about that more in detail because I always like to perhaps introduce how bows and arrows came into being and the history associated with them, and also the various aspects of bows and arrows. Now, bows and arrows have been around for a long time. Three main purposes: hunting, war and recreation. And I don't really think that needs any further explanation. I've called this, yeah, I think that'll be fine, thank you. I need to have some light, but that's okay, thank you.
The one you need,
yeah, no, that's fine, thank you. I've called this slide Archery because of the fact that bows and arrows appear in so many paintings. And you know, you will have seen this with the they're mainly related to the aspects of love, and you know, there you have the cupids and the cherubs, and also Eros standing on his plinth in Piccadilly Circus. The type of bow that he has is very particular. This very fine and very beautiful sculpture has a lovely bow. We call it a curly bow, but it is actually called a recurve bow. And there's another example. There are so many examples of this type of bow being depicted in paintings. And this is the type of bow. It's called a recurve bow or a composite bow. A composite because of the nature of the products, the materials it was made from. And this type of bow we think has been around probably 60,000–70,000 years. When man first evolved in Africa, and as they evolved and as they travelled to the east, and the spear was their main hunting weapon. But then after that, somebody in their how they came to do it, nobody actually knows. But they came up with a design like this. And it's called a composite because of the various materials that it was comprised of. They used horn and antler and bone, and they would hammer them very, very thinly. They created a former to establish this shape, and then they laminated these materials, including sinews, and they glued them together using the glue from the swim bladders of fishes, or as we've recently discovered, glue from bluebell bulbs. That is quite a good glue, quite a good adhesive. But because the glue wasn't waterproof, they had to clad the limbs in leather. And that really, it's a simple thing, but you think, how would they produce a bow like that? How did they have the knowledge to do this? But that's one of the mysteries. And if you look at it, you think the bow should be strung that way. It's not. It's strung that way. This is another mystery. It bends back on itself. And this is the recurve. This is a modern target archery bow. And comprises, it's aluminium and carbon fibre and fiberglass. Not much has changed, has it, in all those years? Only the materials. That's obviously the important thing, and the fact that this can be taken apart, just to make it easier for transporting it. This one was well used for hunting and for shooting from horseback, and also chariots. When they travelled to the east, and the Mongolians have this type of bow here, exactly this. The Chinese have this style of bow. And then it travelled across the Bering Straits into what is now North America, and the Native Americans had this style of bow. It's depicted in shooting from horseback because of its size and also because of its power. Then it travelled from the east to the west, and along the Silk Route, and all the countries en route had bows like this. Even into North Africa, the Egyptians and the Algerians, the Moroccans, the Tunisians, all had bows of this type. I've seen the bows that were recovered from the Egyptian tombs in the pyramids, just the same as this. And but each society, each culture, just made various minor changes to it. Now, what I'll do is to string this. It's never an easy task. It does have a mind of its own, and if it happens first time, it'll be a miracle. I need to use this highly technical piece of cord the wrong way around, just to string it, to get it to bend backwards on itself. Now, this bow has a draw weight, which is the amount of power that's needed to draw it fully, of 60 pounds, and it will send an arrow nearly 300 yards. And you can see this is not a toy. Now, if I stand here, hopefully you might be able to see the transformation. It's worked. That's a miracle. So there we are. This is the bow. This is the one you see here, and here, and here, and here, and all of these. And you'll see this a lot in art. And it travelled really into southern France as well. We have evidence of that, and I'll show you that shortly. So that is the recurve, or the composite bow, and very powerful. But you can imagine that to draw it back its full extent to the cheek, you'd need a very long arrow for that. But they overcame that as well, because they used shorter arrows, probably no more than about 26, 27 inches long. But they would have a piece of probably bamboo or something like that, a reed, attached to their thumb that came inside the bow. So it created a channel for the arrow to come inside the bow. And so they thought of all eventualities. This is the evidence of the in southern France, these cave paintings, and they're dated about 20,000 years. And there you can clearly see this style of bow with these hunter-gatherers. And so that's evidence that it travelled from the east into the west. The archers are adopting very strange shooting positions there. And what they did at the weekends was entirely up to them. The other evidence that we have about the bow comes from dear old Utsi, otherwise known as Frozen Fritz. And his body was discovered in the Alps, the Italian Alps, in 1991. And at first it was thought he was a climber who perished, but they soon realised he was a lot older than that. When his body was taken back to the laboratory for forensic examination, they x-rayed him and also carbon dated him. The carbon dating showed that he was probably about 5,300 years old, and but extremely well preserved in the snow, in the ice. The X-ray showed that his skull had been fractured, and also he had an arrowhead, a flint arrowhead, embedded in the back, in his back, in the left shoulder. So he'd been shot in the back. They don't think necessarily that he bled to death, because the fact his skull had been fractured, that was probably what killed him. So he obviously had a problem with his neighbours there, I think. But in the ice were his artefacts, and they were extremely well preserved. 14 arrow shafts made from dogwood, and 2 of them here still had the flint arrowheads attached, bound on by nettle bindings, which was quite common then. He had his dagger and an axe, and his sandals had been well preserved, leather sandals. But also in the ice was his bow, and it was made from one piece of yew, and it was 1.85 metres long, beautifully preserved and also beautifully made. It was covered in dried blood, and that would have helped to preserve it in the ice. The fact it was made from one piece of yew, that is the first evidence that we have of yew being used as a material for a bow. This is a recent reconstruction of what he thought he looked like. And I think any resemblance there to Ken Livingstone is purely coincidental. But the other information that we have about the bow comes from the biotapestry. Quite interesting information. Just behind this, I bought this card recently in a cathedral shop in Salisbury. I thought it was quite funny. I spy with my little eye something beginning with A. Just before he was shot in the eye with an arrow. But that's Harold. And but further along on the biotapestry is a Norman archer on horseback, and his bow there is no more than about 3 feet long, because I've done a lot of horse riding over the years, and I know you can't shoot one of these from a horse. You'd probably get one arrow away if you were lucky before you fell off. So the actual bow there is quite short. So it may well have been that the Norman archers had something like this for shooting from horseback. Because obviously, being a tapestry, difficult to get all the shapes, and the ladies who were doing the tapestry probably weren't aware of the style. But it was the Vikings in the 11th century that really introduced the bow as we know it. When they invaded the western coast of the British Isles, Wales, they had great victories over the Welsh, and with their longer bows that they brought with them. They were made from ash and also from elm, and they were quite powerful. And the Welsh just had no resources to defend themselves against this force of archers, the Viking archers. And when they were licking their wounds after the battle, they realised they needed something like this. So they developed their own, made from the same materials, from ash and elm, and possibly hazel as well, witch hazel. But they weren't quite as powerful. But then they had great victories against the English, you'll be pleased to hear. And so then the English licking their wounds, thinking, well, you know, that's what we need something like that. So in very simple terms, that's really how the longbow developed. And the Welsh archers had a formidable reputation. And this developed as well alongside the English, particularly in North Wales. The English, well, so I got the English longbow there because that's really what it's known as now. But the longbow was made from yew, Taxus baccata. And it's a myth to think that it's made from English yew. It's not. The yew that you find in churchyards just isn't good enough. If you look at a yew tree in the churchyard, the trunks are usually quite short, stumpy, and they're twisted. And they're very gnarled, because the best timber for making the bows came from the bole of the tree, from the trunk of the tree. The yew tree in the churchyards is considered to be a symbol of life and death. And also it was a meeting place. People would gather round the yew trees. They did make bows from the boughs of the tree, but they were only for juveniles and also just for practice. The timber just wasn't good enough, not strong enough, and to create the powerful bows that were needed in battle. The best timber for making the bows came from Spain and from the Venetians. Spain was a good source, but as we were regularly at war with Spain, then the sources there dried up. But the Venetians provided fantastic timber. We were importing timber from the Venetians, spruce timber, in huge quantities for our shipbuilding. We were also importing their wine, fine Venetian wine, and by the barrel. And then it was discovered that they had a mountain yew. And the mountain yew grew very tall and very straight. And they could calculate that this timber was ideal for making bows because of the fact it was tall and straight. And so then we were importing the bow staves. Now a bow stave, it is a piece of timber like this. They would cut the trunk, the bole of the tree, into 7-foot lengths, split them in half, split them in quarters, into eighths and probably into 16ths, to harvest as many bow staves as they could from those trunks. And then they'd have to be seasoned for a minimum of 3 years. Now we were importing that timber from the Venetians alongside the spruce timber and their wine, but we weren't paying for it. Very clever transaction. We imposed a taxation on the importation of the wine. We'll still buy your wine, but we want the yew bow staves for nothing. So we imposed a taxation of 10 bow staves for every barrel of wine that we took from the Venetians. And so if a galleon brought in 400 barrels of wine, there could be 4,000 bow staves included in that shipment. And so they had very strict quality control over the seasoning period of the timber. And it provided the most fantastic longbows ever. Now, no story about bows and arrows would be complete to the chap who's already been mentioned this evening. Good old Robin Hood. I also, Robin Hood rhymes with Hollywood, or Pinewood. There you have Errol Flynn in the 1938 film, The Adventures of Robin Hood. Now, you're all too young to remember that first time round, but I think it's probably one of the best Robin Hood films that's ever been made. Great swashbuckling film. I mean, historically, it's a load of rubbish, but as an adventure film, it's brilliant. We do probably all remember Richard Green, or those of a certain age. He was my inspiration, and I was living in Surrey with my parents at the time, and that's where, near Oxshott in Surrey, and that's where they used to film a lot of the outside shots of that series. And I used to think, oh, it'd be great to see Robin Hood riding through the forest, riding through the gloom, or make Marion with him, but it never actually happened. Kevin Costner, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Now, there's a lovely story that links these two together. I used to say, it must be true because I read it in the newspaper. But I'm assured it is true. A member of the clergy confirmed that the story is true. A young couple getting married in church. And the bride had asked that after the wedding ceremony, she'd like to walk down the aisle with her new husband to the theme tune from Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Everything I Do It For You by Bryan Adams, all organised. So they go through the wedding ceremony, go into the vestry to sign the register. As they come out to proceed to walk down the aisle, the dear old organist, who wasn't really up to date with the modern music, started playing Robin Hood. And I'm told that's true. There you have Jonas Armstrong from the BBC series of Robin Hood. An interesting variation on the theme. Then Robin Hood popped up in Doctor Who a couple of Christmases ago. So he's been getting around. Daffy Duck here has got his own Wikipedia page to his adventures of Robin Hood, and there he is with Friar Tuck. There's another fantastic film, I think it's one of the best, and that's Robin Hood, Men in Tights, by Mel Brooks. Brilliant film. And in Robin Hood, in the film, Robin Hood is being castigated by some of his merry men for not being very brave. And he says, well, slightly apocryphally, I may not be the only Robin Hood, but I'm the only one with an English accent. And there you have Russell Crowe in the last film of Robin Hood. And it was really the accent that let him down. I mean, the story was a variation on the theme, a little bit more sort of historical correctness about the film. But really in that film it was his accent that let him down, because he couldn't decide whether he's Australian or Michael Parkinson. But looking at these pictures, can anyone see a difference in any of in one picture compared to the rest?
This one's
Yeah, he's got one of these, hasn't he?
Yeah.
And almost identical to this. Well, I was intrigued because watching the trailers to the run-up of the very first programme, I saw this and I thought, oh, I wonder why. And in the first episode, he's asked by one of his merry men, Robin, why have you got a bow like this? Why haven't you got a longbow? And his reply was that he'd just returned from the Holy Land, and a Saracen had given him the bow. Well, that's fair enough. But the truth is that series was filmed in Hungary. And this is a Hungarian old Scythian bow. And so I think they were using bows that were available to them. So it was just a variation on the theme, but quite interesting in many respects. Now, the bowyer was the chap who made the bows. And if you look at this, these are all familiar family names, aren't they? And so if you look at this, you think, well, why hasn't the bowyer smoothed out the lumps and bumps? Well, they're there for a reason, because the bow stave will have knots in it. And so he has to see the bow in the bow stave when he's making it. And it's a very, very special art, a great gift, in fact, for making a bow. So he will have the knot, and where the heartwood rises, the sapwood will rise.
Yes.
And so it creates, if he smoothed that out, it would create a weakness, and it would break. And so down there you have a knot, and so you've got the undulations in the sapwood. The sapwood is the back of the bow. The heartwood is the belly of the bow, and together they form a natural spring. The sapwood is a good resistor of tension. The heartwood is a good resistor of compression. So as it bends, this stretches, this compresses, this shrinks in. So, and that is really what gives it its power. And the power really comes also from the heavy D section of the bow. This is quite critical. It couldn't be a flat bow. It wouldn't have the power. All the power is contained within that construction. The arrowsmith was the chap who made the arrowheads. There are 21 arrowheads that are catalogued by the Museum of London. 16 are English medieval and 5 are Viking. There's a crossover between the two. So the arrowsmith was the blacksmith who made the arrowheads. This is a number 10, armour-piercing bodkin. And that will pierce armour at 200 yards. Even if it didn't pierce the armour, the force could knock the armoured soldier to the ground. The fletcher was the chap who produced the shafts. Majority were made from ash, because the ash is very long-grained. It allowed all the energies transmitted from the bow to travel down the shaft. If he used a timber that was short-grained, it would split, and it wouldn't be effective. The fletcher also fletched the shaft with mainly with the grey goose feathers, because they were plentiful. And so that was a skill in itself. I'll pass around one or two of the arrows in a short while, and you'll see that the fletchings are bound on. That's because the glue wasn't waterproof. The stringer was the chap who produced the string, not just an ordinary piece of string. Great skill in this. This bow has a draw weight of 80 pounds, and it's like picking up a bag and a half of cement with one hand. And they went up to 160 pounds draw weight. Some of the ones that came off the Mary Rose. So the stringer would create the string from hemp and flax, horsehair, sometimes incorporating silk if they had some silk. And so this is, for this draw weight, it's a 16 strand. And they went up to 24 strands. And then the stringer would create the loop by splicing it into the strands. He binds on a serving, which is the green binding here. That's to protect the string from the arrow, from the knock. It's twisted towards the bottom, and then you have the bowyer's knot, which allows it to be adjusted quite quickly. So great, all these artisans had great skills. Now the longbow is considered to be the first weapon of mass destruction because of the first WMD, because of the havoc that it wreaked upon the enemy. The logistics are quite staggering. And if you think that at Agincourt, the accepted numbers are that an army of 5,000 English archers defeated an army of 18,000 French with this and the bow. And the archers, English archers, and the Welsh archers would practice to loose, which is the term, to loose 12 arrows in 1 minute. And that's been proven, it can be done. I mean, you're not shooting at a small target, you're shooting at a whole body of men in front of you, 200 yards, 250 yards. So all you have to do is to get the angle right. That's what they practiced. The angle had to be between 42 to 45 degrees, get the arrows to drop down onto the enemy at that distance. And gravity just ensured that they arrived with force. 5,000 English archers, they could shoot 12 arrows in 1 minute. That meant there could be, if they all shot at the same time, there could be 60,000 arrows in the air at any one time. Formidable. And it's no wonder it said that the French went to church before a battle with the English to pray for salvation against the English archers. But over a period of 30 minutes, that's 1.8 million arrows that could be loosed upon the enemy. And but they went prepared. They had workshops, the English, and those artisans I showed you, they had workshops in Calais and in Fécamp in northern France. And they were producing the bows, the arrows, the arrowheads and the strings there in factories. And they had very strict quality control. There were night watch patrols that went round these workshops, these factories, to ensure that the men weren't working at night, lest they produced poor quality products. And if they were found to be working, they could be heavily punished. They travelled as families. Wives and young daughters would help to provide food and medical aid, such as it was, rudimentary medical assistance. But young boys from the age of 7 were given wheelbarrows and sent out into the battlefield during a lull in the battle to retrieve as many of the shafts as they could from the bodies and from the ground. And so it said it was character building for them, and I'm sure it probably was. But the heads were never fixed on. This is the clever part about it, because even if the French got hold of an English arrow and intended to shoot it back, if they pulled it out of the body of one of their compatriots, it would probably leave the head inside the body. So they'd have a bare shaft to shoot back. And because the heads, say, weren't pinned on, they would fill the socket with hot beeswax. And then when it dries, it holds it in position. But when it's in the body of a man or a horse, the heat of the body softens the beeswax and makes it, so the boys can pull the shafts out of the bodies, leaving the head in the body. Because the English archers also kept their arrows in rotting carcasses on the battlefield. So it had bacteria. So even if you didn't die immediately, you got this lump of festering metal. And in Agincourt it rained, and it said the archers were literally up to their proverbials in mud and diarrhoea. So they had another form of contamination. So as somebody said, they did think of everything. There was no such thing as Geneva Convention in those days. The V sign. And please don't think I'm being rude. But this originated, or I said it originated from the English archers. That if a French captured an English archer, the first thing they'd do is to chop off the fingers on both hands so he couldn't draw his bow. So as a sign of defiance to the French, we've still got our fingers. We can still shoot at you. So this is, there's other forms of signs of defiance here as well, from the early 1990s. And historians have really debunked that, suggesting that if the French captured an English archer, they wouldn't chop his fingers off, they'd chop his head off instead. So he still had problems drawing his bow. Now the game of darts is believed to have originated from the English archers, or the archer, I keep saying English, but the archers. And during a lull in the battle, they turn an empty barrel of ale on its side, put a cross on the bottom, and then they throw their arrows at the mark on the bottom of the beer barrel. That tradition seems to continue because of the traditions I've seen. The darts are referred to as arrows, and plenty of beer is consumed as well. And the quiver. If you see Robin Hood, invariably with a back quiver, like this. Well, there again, that's Hollywood. This is just too cumbersome. This is a reconstruction of what a Tudor quiver would have looked like, and it would actually hang from the belt, as you can see in this picture here. This young archer has the quiver hanging from his belt. And so this is really from Tudor times, and had they been around, it's more of a fashion statement than more than anything else. And because they're nicely made. And had they been around at the time, it might have had Dolce & Gabbana or YSL. But what they actually used was this. This is a sheath of arrows, and far more practical, less glamorous than the leather. But it's from linen, and inside there's a leather spacer with 24 holes. Now if you play golf, you know from the golf bags you've got the spacers to keep the clubs apart. Well, this is really what this is intended for. And we know this because 3 of these leather spacers were recovered from the Mary Roads. And they were in perfect condition. And all 3 had 24 holes in them as well. So that's stitched into the linen. There's a toggle, a draw cord, and a toggle, bone horn toggle to keep them dry. And that's how they would carry their arrows. And during battle, the page boys would give them a sheath like this. He'd call for another sheath, and there's a couple of minutes shooting in there for them. So it's less glamorous than the leather, but far more practical. Now in war, the Cheshire and the Flintshire archers, they formed a very strong band of archers at Cressay and Poitiers, and also at Agincourt. And it was a very strong alliance, so much so that King Richard II employed 400 of them as bodyguards, because he was so distrusted by his people but he was aware of the fearsome reputation that these Cheshire and Flintshire archers had. So he felt safe by having them around. And the Chamberlain of Chester was the first to provide them with any form of uniform, the green and white tunic. The chap in the back here is wearing a red overcoat, but underneath you've got the green and white. And they were paid the princely sum of 4 old pennies a day from the time they mustered, and possibly up to 6 old pennies depending on their rank. But these were chaps that worked on the land during the spring and the summer. That's why many of the battles were in the autumn and early winter, because they didn't have any work to do. And they were paid from the time they mustered. They would muster at Chester Castle and also at Macclesfield. And then they would walk either to Sandwich in Kent, which would take about 14 days, or to Plymouth, which would take 21 days. But they were paid for that journey, and on the basis that they wouldn't rape and pillage on the way down. But there's no suggestion that being paid stopped them from raping and pillaging. So they had this very formidable reputation. Now, I'm involved with an archaeological dig just on the outskirts of Chester, close to the Eaton Hall and the Grosvenor property, but it's on private land. The dig has been going about 16 years now, and over that period, during the summer periods, they've recovered over 900 bodies from this site. It's an old chapel site. It's only 400 yards, it's only 40 yards from the Pulford Brook, which is the border between England and Wales. And it was a chapel site. And just over 2 years ago, we have students coming from all over the world to work on this. They're guaranteed to be able to work on a body. And a couple of years or so ago, a student working on a single grave, which was unusual, because they're normally piled together, the bodies are piled on top of each other. This was a single grave, and this piece of metal was found. And at first the student thought it was a rusty nail, but what's a rusty nail doing there? What it actually turned out to be was one of these. And John Moores University x-rayed it and forensically examined it, and I've had reconstruction made. It's a number 7 needle bodkin, and it's designed to penetrate chainmail. Chainmail would offer no resistance to that at all. But from the position there, it didn't actually enter the chest cavity, because there's no sign of any damage to the ribcage. And usually if something like that penetrates the body, there's going to be an impact on the bone. The chances of that not happening are pretty remote. What we think happened was that the poor chap who they've assessed was about 35. He wasn't a chap who worked on the land, because his fingers, bones of his fingers didn't exhibit any signs of hard work. So that's principally why he's in a single grave. He could have been a nobleman, either English or Welsh. His body is carbon dated to between 1280 to 1320, right at the time of the border wars between England and Wales. And if you think there's only 40 yards from the Welsh border. And so what we think happened, he could have been standing on the tower at the chapel, or maybe at Chester Castle. And the archer shot up at him. And the arrow went up through his groin, pierced his lung, pierced his heart. And he died almost instantly, because again there's no sign of any infection. And but this was there's only 4 of these have ever been found, and this is the only one that's been found in the body. So which is very unfortunate for him, but very fortunate for us, because it gives it a date, and a fairly precise date as well. I'll pass it round, so if you can have a look at it. And about 18 months ago, another one appeared in a body, and it was this. This is the X-ray of the head itself, and this type has never been seen before. It's been called a Chester Type 16. A Type 16 is this is the standard war arrow. and if you can maybe see on there, that's a Type 16 that's recorded. And one of these was actually found on the site, but not in a body. And the only other one to be found was off the Mary Rose. So we're very lucky to have this one. But this one was found in a body of the same era, same period. And it's a nice, nasty piece of metal. And these have been perfectly made. So
today, don't they, for weighing?
Sorry?
They have that kind of head for weighing.
Yes, for the barbs. Now you can have a bow as good as you like and an archer to match it, but if you don't have feathers and ash and horn and silk and steel and varnish, you might as well spit at your enemy. So, because the arrow is the business end of what these battles are all about. The shaft is, well, the arrow is the perfect aerodynamic missile. It's never been improved upon in its style. 3 fletchings, not 2, not 4. 2, it doesn't give it balance in flight. 4 is a waste of material. And so the fletcher would fletch, and the shaft with three fletchings. They're great. The fletchings are grey goose predominantly. And an order went out from the Tower of London in December 1414 for 1,190,000 grey goose feathers to be supplied to the Tower from the 35 shires that existed then, to be supplied by Michaelmas 1415. Michaelmas is the end of September. We're coming up to Michaelmas now, the harvest period. And at Michaelmas it's traditional to eat the goose. And also there are goose fairs at Michaelmas. Nottingham has a famous goose fair. Well, they probably had so many bald geese, they just didn't know what to do. But as I mentioned earlier, the shaft is made from ash, or from aspen, but mainly ash, because it was plentiful, and it's very long grain. It allows all the energy transmitted from the bow to travel down the shaft. And the shaft, in fact, needs to bend. It needs to flex. As the arrow leaves the bow, all that power causes, because of the length of the grain, causes the arrow to bend. It bends in one direction, straightens out, bends in the other direction before it actually straightens out and goes to the target. That actually happens in milliseconds, but it happens. And they knew that. That great, tremendous knowledge that they had. This bending is called the archer's paradox. And if a shaft doesn't flex like that, it spines. Then it's no good. It spines. That's right. Now, if you look at the arrows that are coming around, you'll see that there's a black line. You have at right angles to the nock. The nock is where the arrow fits onto the bowstring. And at right angles to that, there's a black line. Now, we only know this from the arrows that were rescued from the Mary Rose. About 4,000 arrow shafts were brought up from the Mary Rose. When the archaeologists looked up, and they saw that at right angles to the nock, there was a slit. And they found some small pieces of bone in the slit, and came to the conclusion that the nock is reinforced with bone. That is because of all the force imposed upon it. Otherwise it would split. These massive draw-weight bows could cause this to happen. So they had to guard against it. Now, progress, 1252, Henry III decreed that the longbow should be a military weapon. Great victories at Falkirk, at Crécy and Poitiers. And in 1363, King Edward III decreed that all men between the ages of 16 and 60 should practice archery at the butts. The butts are the targets, at the butts on a Sunday. And they were prevented from playing these unlawful games, such as handball and volleyball and football. Football was considered to be a dreadful game. And if they were caught playing these games, then they could be severely punished. So they had to practice at the butts on a Sunday. Now if you're the butt of the joke, you're the target of the joke, aren't you? And if you see Robin Hood shooting at a target like this in the left-hand corner, he had great foresight. That didn't come in until about 1820. What they would shoot at are the butts, which were earth mounds, and that was the only form of practice. There was one other form of practice, and it's one I enjoy, and that's called the clout. The clout are two targets, 180 yards apart, with one here on the ground, and so you see this chap at a good angle to get the arrows to travel that distance, they drop down, and that was the practice. Now the reason for the clout. You know the expression, don't cast a clout till May be out. Don't take any clothes off until the May blossom is out, otherwise you'll catch your death of cold. Well, also a clout was actually a cloth, and in Elizabethan terms it was a cloth nappy. But I don't think we need to go there. But in archery terms, a cloth bag would be tied to a stake and it'd be lying on the ground. They'd pace out 180 yards, 180 paces or so, another cloth bag tied to the ground, tied to the stake lying on the ground. And in each cloth bag would be a live cat, a feral cat. A feral cat. Yes, I give this talk to WI, and this is where I think I'm going to be asked to leave. But they were practiced to shoot at a moving target, and because the bag would be moving around on the ground. But if somebody came along and let the cat out the bag, then the game's over. Now you probably know this one, but being in Wales, maybe I should have erased it. A law was passed in 1403 in Chester, making it, I can't say legal, but permissible for an Englishman to shoot a Welshman with a longbow inside the city walls after sunset. And that law was only repealed last year. One of the last things that David Cameron did. And the same law exists in York, but it was permissible to shoot a Scotsman inside the city walls of York. But at the Battle of Agincourt, there was an intriguing sound, and that was the sound of gunfire. Despite all the bows, activity of the bows, handguns were being introduced, but they were pretty useless. They didn't have the range, they didn't have the firepower, they probably couldn't hit the proverbial barn door at 80 yards, whereas the longbowmen could max 250 yards, 300 yards, and 12 arrows in 1 minute. So they were outgunned literally by the bows. But by 1500, muskets were becoming more dominant. It was easier to train a musketeer than it was to train an archer. But King Henry VIII decreed that 40,000 bow staves should be kept in stock in the Tower of London in 1510. He only came to the throne in 1509, so this is quite a major decision for him. But such was his belief in the longbow as a military weapon. And don't forget that 10 bow staves, each barrel of wine that came into the country was accompanied by 10 bow staves. So he probably was enjoying all the wine that was coming in all these bow staves as well. But by 1542, the law for practice at the butts fell into disuse because of the development of the muskets. They were becoming much better, and more. The fire was a lot easier, and the musketeers weren't exposed, as were the archers, to the enemy fire. But the Mary Rose, she's thrown up really some quite intriguing facts. She capsized in Portsmouth Harbour in 1545, and it's thought that many of those on board went from instead of being inside, balancing the ship, they all went to one side of the vessel to see the king's vessel as he sailed past, and so this caused the vessel to capsize. The archaeologists have come up with some very intriguing information. and that's to do with they've been able to identify the trades or the skills of many of the skeletal remains that were recovered from the Mary Rose. They've been able to identify who was a gunner, the chap who worked on the cannons, from the damage to his legs, because many of them suffered damage to their legs if they didn't get out of the way when the recoil of the cannon. And so a lot had damaged bones. With the archers, the damage was different. This action of drawing this heavy, very heavy draw weight bows actually made them deformed. They produced massive muscles on one side of their body, on their shoulders and on their elbows. And by doing this, you think 12 arrows in a minute, practicing all the time. This is what they were doing all the time, this action. So much so that the scapula, because of this massive muscle attachment, the scapula became rippled. On the other side of the body, normal. And so that was a clue. This chap was an archer. Also with the clavicle. Here there's a membrane. And this membrane, these two bones fused together in our late teens, early 20s. But with these archers, that didn't happen. On the other side, it did. On the right-hand side of the body, it didn't. And then Swansea University published a report a couple of years ago. They did work on the elbow. Their conclusion was that the drawing elbow, the elbow on the right-hand side, right arm, was 48% larger than the corresponding arm. Again, yeah, it's massive. These chaps, they weren't tall. They're probably no more than about 5'8", 5'10". But they had incredible physiques, but they were deformed, lopsided, I think. The Spanish Armada, the archers were on that, and they'd use an arrow like this. It's called a rope cutter. It is a recognised arrowhead. It would be razor sharp and designed, well, you think designed to cut rope, but no, it doesn't. The arrows spin in flight, and the chances of cutting a rigging will be virtually nil. I mean, Robin Hood could probably have done it, but I don't think he was a very good sailor. But what we think, in fact, is that the archers targeted the sails on the enemy vessels. The sails were full of wind. That was their motive power. So if the 50 archers on board targeted the sails, the canvas, these were razor sharp. They tear into the canvas, literally letting the wind out of the sails, and making it more difficult for the vessels to manoeuvre. So, but it's quite an intriguing arrowhead. The bow was eventually withdrawn from service in 1595 because of the development of the weapons of fire, the muskets. But by 1596, Queen Elizabeth I was so fed up of hearing these stories of men being severely injured and some being killed, playing this dreadful game of football. She wanted the law for practice at the butts to be reinstated, to restrain unlawful games and to maintain skill in the use of the bow, because she felt that gave them a more discipline than being a musketeer. She was a great archer herself. Recreation. I've spoken about hunting, I've spoken about the war, but the archery has always been favoured by monarchs as a sport, and a very social sport. There is actually, I've been doing research into this, because there is an organisation that was established in 1787 in Wrexham, called the Royal British Bowmen. And very few people have heard of them. Sir Foster Cunliffe, who lived at Acton Park in Wrexham, established this and got patronage from the Prince of Wales, who became George IV. And they had great social gatherings all around North Wales. All the grand houses of North Wales would host these archery competitions between April and October, every other Friday. And they kept going until 1880, but then there's this other sport that took over from it that was cheaper to organise, and that was tennis. Tennis became the popular social sport at the time. Anyway, coming back to recreation, archery became an Olympic sport in the 1908 Games in White City in London. There you have the ladies in their Edwardian costumes, shooting at the butts. And obviously, umbrellas were the order of the day there, so nothing new there, is there? This lady, Queenie Newell, won a gold medal, and this chap, William Dodd, also won a gold medal. And they beat France into second place. So a great jubilation of that. But there were only two teams competing. So. But you can see they're shooting at the target, this type of butt. And this was introduced by the Prince of Wales, so became King George IV, in about 1820. He formalised all the rules of target archery, social target archery. And he created this target with the gold, the red, the blue, the black and the white. So that's nine points in gold going down, and 9, 7, 5, 3 and 1. And he formalised the distance for shooting, 50 and 60 yards for ladies, 60 and 80 up to 100 yards for men, shooting at the butts. This lady is in the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow in 2010. And she, 2012, and she's got a different type of bow, a very mechanical type of bow. It's called a compound bow. This lady is shooting the more traditional recurve bow, and so this is really how it's developed. This lady was in the young lady was in the Commonwealth Game equivalent of the Paralympics. So it's a sport that's enjoyed by all. But this is really where we are in terms of modern technology. This is the compound bow. I have an example here. And it was developed by this chap, an American, Hollis Allen, between 1967 and 1970. And it's quite a formidable weapon. This has a draw weight of 50 pounds. But will send an arrow nearly 500 yards. And it's fast and powerful.
Is it the one that drops after they've taken the shots?
No, that's what they can do.
Yeah.
There's a bit more weight. That's the other one. That why they do that, I have no idea. No, that's just purely for effect, I think.
So is that it?
Yeah, I think so. But if you look at this, I mean, the engineers amongst you will understand the reasons.
Pulleys.
There's pulleys. Yeah, if you want to lift a heavy weight, you use a pulley with all the falls. And this is what this is. It looks like 3 strings, there's only one. And it has a draw weight of 50 pounds, but when I draw it back, like this, the pulleys, or the cams as they are known as, they go over, like that. Now I'm only holding half of that draw weight, but all the power is still there. And so that is massive. So that enables them. They've got a little sight here with a hole-in pinhole that lines up with the sight there, and they can be deadly accurate. It was developed as a sniper weapon for the special forces in Vietnam, the American special forces in Vietnam. And it would shoot an arrow like this, aluminium with plastic fletchings. This is all man-made. So they're not affected by humidity. I've been in the jungle in Vietnam, and I've been also in the jungle in Malaysia, and I know how humid it is underneath the canopy. So how effective the special forces were with this as a sniper weapon, I'm not really certain. They didn't have this type of head. This is a target head, a target pile. They would have an explosive head. So you wouldn't hear it coming, but you certainly knew when it had arrived. And so, again, it's quite a formidable weapon.
It's frightening to look at, actually, isn't it?
It's the black, I think. But I mean, that takes all the fun out of archery by having something. That takes all the fun out of archery by having that sort of accuracy. I mean, you can get them with laser sights now. So it's literally laser guided as well. But everyday sayings. Now, I've said some, these are the others. And the butt of the joke, I mentioned that earlier on. If you're the butt of the joke, you're the target of the joke. The archers would be told to brace themselves. Well, to do that, they need to do two things. One is to put their bracer on. I draw with my left arm, left hand, so the bracer goes onto my right arm. If I didn't wear that, there'd be blood because of the slap of the bowstring. And it is very painful. Even after a day shooting, my arm is still red underneath there, and slightly swollen, but at least I haven't drawn blood. So I would brace myself. I will also brace the bow. And to do that, I need to use the second string to my bow. And it's a similar principle to the one when I braced the other bow. But this is the traditional form. The last thing I need is a knot. No, it's okay. It'll be right. So this is 80-pound draw weight, and the only way I can get it to bend, and it doesn't get easier, is to do that. So I will have braced myself. I'll have my bracer on, and I brace my bow. And to check that the bracing height is right, because if it's highly strung, then it's no good to man nor beast. It has to be, the bracing height has to be right. So to do that, I use rule of thumb. It needs just adjusting slightly now, but it should be about 6 inches, maximum 6.5 inches. So as a general rule of thumb, how many times do you hear that? But this is for checking the bracing height of the bow. Spare string to your bow. How often do you use that? You've got a spare string to your bow, you've got something in reserve, haven't you? And so they always carried spare strings about them. But because they didn't have any pockets, they might have a small leather purse to keep some personal possessions in. They would keep it under their hat. They would be told to keep it under their hat. They would keep several strings under their hat. That's mainly to keep them dry. Because if the strings get wet, then they're stretch. Playing fast and loose. You wouldn't think that playing fast and loose is an archery term. It's not Robin Hood playing fast and loose with Maid Marian. But when they were shooting at the butts, if somebody was close to the butts in practice, they'd shout fast. But if they shouted fast and then loosed the arrow, they're playing fast and loose. They're playing a dangerous game. And keep tabs on. Keep in touch with what's going on. Now these are the tabs. They're leather. Finger protectors that you wear on the drawing hand. And there's a slot there for that's where the arrow fits onto the bowstring. That protects your fingers from the bowstring. You do that half a dozen times, oh boy, does it hurt. And that will strip the skin off your fingers. But that you could shoot all day without any problem at all. And there are very technical forms of this nowadays, but this is the simplest. And I think it's just as good as anything else. So keep tabs on. You probably noticed with the arrows, the shafts that have been coming around, that one of the fletchings is a different colour. That's the cock fletching. And when it's applied to the bow, right, like this, the cock fletching is on the outside. If the archer does it that way round, it's a cock up. Shoot your bolt and pick a quarrel, they came from the crossbow. And the bolt was the small arrow that the crossbow shot. And so if you shot your bolt, it could take you nearly a minute to reload the crossbow. So the archer, English archer, 12 hours in 1 minute compared to the crossbow one. Pick a quarrel, that means pick a bolt with a four-sided head. And so they were told to pick a quarrel. That means to get ready for a fight. And so if you pick a quarrel with somebody, you have to be prepared, hopefully just a fight orally, but not physically. And the bolt from the blue, where did that come from? That's literally the bolts that came out of the blue, because they could be so fast. But the crossbow had its Achilles heel, and that was its string, the bowstring. At Crécy, an army of 4,000 archers defeated the French, who employed 15,000 Genoese crossbow. And they just turned tails and ran, because they'd lost all the power in their crossbows, because it rained. And the bowstrings got wet, and they stretched, and they had no force in their bows at all. If a longbow string gets wet, a couple of minutes to change the string, no problem at all. So, I mean, the crossbow was a great weapon, but it did have its Achilles heel. Keeping in the family, the archer, the arrowsmith, the bowman, the bowmaker, the bowyer, the fletcher, the stringer, and the string fellow all worked miracles during the great years of the boar bow. All of these are very common family names, aren't they?
Yeah.
I'm sure that Peter Stringfellow knows something about playing fast and loose.
My niece is a Fletcher.
Is she? Oh, well, there we are. And the legend of Robin Hood. He seemed to have had a good life. Been around from 1190 to about 1324, so I'd like to have known what his secret was. There are 5 characters there that are possibly connected with Robin Hood, but it was Ivanhoe when he wrote, Walter Scott rather, when he wrote Ivanhoe, that really brought the story of Robin Hood alive, and that's what Hollywood and Pinewood have picked up on. And a great story, you know. But there's a lovely story that Robin Hood's death. He's on his deathbed, and he says to Little John, "Little John, can you bring me my bow and an arrow?" And he said, I want to loose the arrow, and where it lies, where it rests, that's where I want to be buried." So he struggles, draws the bow for all his worth and might, looses the arrow, and he's laid to rest on top of his wardrobe. I mean, like anything in history, there's always going to be something that's going to confound the accepted view. And that's William Langland, when in 1377 he wrote about the dreams of Piers Plowman. And in that, he writes in one simple sentence about the rhymes of Robin Hood and Ranulph, Earl of Chester. Well, we know that Ranulph, Earl of Chester existed because he was Ranulph de Blondeville. He was Earl of Chester and Lincoln. He died in 1232, and it was he who besieged Nottingham Castle in 1194 on behalf of King Richard I, Richard Coeur de Lion. And so he was a great monarchist. So if Ranulph de Blondeville existed, and William Langland can write about Robin Hood and Ranulph, Earl of Chester in the same sentence, and maybe Robin Hood did exist after all.
I'm sure you did.
Yes. But they pays your money and you takes your choice on that one. But so this really brings me to the end, and my fee goes to Clare House, the Children's Hospital, so thank you very much for that.
But I'm sure you will agree it was very, very interesting. Absolutely. I learned a few things listening to that. You know the guy going around with a wheelbarrow to picking up the arrows in between the fighting. I always thought the Denbighshire County Council started recycling. I've got that one. And also, something, when you were saying the sayings there you had, there's one that I've heard many, many times in my life. And I thought about it while I was over there. And I saw the lady there, standing there with the longbow in her hand for most of the evening. And the saying that I used to hear was, behind a good man, there's always a good woman. With a longbow in her hand. I was also a bit worried when I heard the mobile went off somewhere, I think. And I thought, it's probably Robin telling us the 850 flight's okay. I'd just like to say thank you very, very much for coming down to give us this very, very interesting talk. And I just have wondering, has anybody got any questions for before? Yeah?
The tree, the Ute Mountain, is it? Or whatever?
Mountain View.
Yeah. This split, very good then.
Yes.
Yeah. Thing, yeah.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah, because it was very tall and very straight trunked. Yes, so it had good grade.
I've been witnessing archery a lot lately because there's an archery club in Trevenant that meets every Saturday afternoon, and they have all these big targets set right across the field, right just past the community hall, if anybody wants to go and see it.
Yes.
Did they actually make a left-handed bow on longbows in the 13th century?
No, because I draw with my left hand, and it's something I've done from the age of 12 for some strange reason, and I can do I'm sort of not quite ambidextrous, but almost. But I wouldn't have been any good to them as an archer, because if I draw with my left hand, I'm in consort with the devil.
Next to you.
Yeah, yes. And my wife probably thinks I still am. But no, this one was made for me. It doesn't affect the actual physical characteristics of the bow, but what the bowyer does is to put an arrow plate.
Yeah.
That's mother of pearl. And for me, because that's the side that the arrow will rest on my hand. If I'm right-handed, draw with my right hand, it'll be the other side. So he'll put the arrow plate on that side. But it doesn't affect the characteristics of the bow. That's the only identifying mark that there is. But they didn't have such luxuries in those days. No. So thank you, that's an interesting question.
Are there any archery butts on the North Wales?
Trevenant?
Trevenant.
Archery club in Trevenant.
I mean the actual mound.
No, but I didn't know it here because it would have gone on. Shottick in Wirral, the church at Shottick, St Michael's. In the porch they have grooves in the sandstone, and they've been cut by where the archers have sharpened their arrowheads, and because they used to muster there. Shottick then was a small port on the banks of the River Dee, now obviously now silted up. But right next to that is a field, and it's called the Butts, and that's where the archery practice would have taken place. So if you have a Butts Lane, Great Butts, Little Butts, Butts Street, the chances are archery would have taken place. That's where butts would have been established. So there's still a connection. They don't exist physically, but they exist by name in the association of butts.
Okay.
When you loose the arrow, does the shaft run across the top of the hand
Yes.
directly?
Yeah.
So you don't need any protection there?
No.
Right.
It's some people. I've got 1 or 2 scars on here because of the fletching. If it's not shaved properly, it will catch and can cut a groove in the skin.
Presumably the fletching, therefore, also goes across the top of the hand.
Yeah, the fletching does. Yeah.
Does that not distort the flight of the arrow?
No, the fletchings are so soft, but it is just the spine or the quill really that has to be shaved and has to be sliced precisely. And sometimes, in fact, they would, as with this, if you may have noticed when they came round, they're bound with string, with just linen thread at the bottom. That is to stop that from happening.
Right.
But that's a luxury, and so it would happen. In some cases it wouldn't. This is a target arrow, and those fletchings, the parabolic fletchings, are just glued on. So they just have to be shaved off, just sort of slightly chamfered, so they don't strip the skin off your hand. Yeah. So that's an interesting question.
Well,
I did an archery course more years ago than I care to remember with a chap locally who some of you may remember called Ellis Shepherd.
Yeah.
And we had fiberglass bows, and he put sights on them, in that he put a piece of elastoplast down the front of the face of the bow and put a pin in.
Yeah.
And then you used that as a sight and raised or lowered the pin according to whether you wanted to elevate or depress. Did they used to do anything similar with the longbow?
The regulations from the British Longbow Society stipulate it should be bare bow. But then in some competitions they do allow a piece of tape or sometimes a rubber band on top or bottom limb. So that rubber band, the placing of that rubber band will give you an indication for the...
But historically, did they use something similar historically or nothing at all?
That was just purely bare bow. And it was instinct, yeah, and practice.
And I suppose you shooting at an elevation rather than at a target.
It was the elevation they had to practice. And they would have somebody standing by them, actually with an equilateral triangle out of wood, or just constructed like that, so they could just hold it and make certain that he got the angle right. 45 degrees. You wouldn't, if you go beyond 45 degrees, it shortens the distance. If you go below 42 degrees, it shortens the distance. So you've got to be fairly accurate between those angles. But I mean, I think it's cheating to have something like that on anyway. So
It was a beginner's course.
yes, well that's fine, great, and it was a fiberglass bow anyway. So
Exactly. So it didn't count.
Didn't count. No. No, well done for trying. That's the important thing.
okay, it's fine. Right, last couple of questions, Jeff, please. Right.
At Agincourt, wasn't it? Did it pour with rain for a long time? So you say after a couple of minutes they'd have to change their string.
Well, yes, the archers would.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just wondering how many strings.
Oh, thousands. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they'd be.
But they had spare bows anyway. So if a string stretched, then they'd just go to another bow, and then they'd have people there just restringing the bow. It wouldn't take very long to do it.
In the film, there's a chap at the front who's like, aim fire. Would they have somebody like that?
Well, these are the chaps that sort of the leaders of the archers. These were the chaps that got a groat and a half a day instead of a groat. They got 6 old pennies a day instead of 4 old pennies a day.
Yeah.
So they were the masters. Majority of those were yeomen. Yeah, they weren't lords, but they weren't workers, from the land. They were the ones who had a little bit more intelligence about them.
Would they be a bowman themselves, or would they be just a chap?
No, they'd be a bowman. Yeah, a yeoman bowman.
They just seemed to stand there shouting. They
Yeah.
went to aim fire.
Yeah.
So it all went in.
Yeah. We do that now and sort of sometimes have a volley of, particularly on Agincourt Day. We commemorate Agincourt.
Barry, you got last question? Yes.
Just as a young lad, we used to play what's called Manchester darts, and that was just a bowl of wood with just doubles on the outside of the centre. But it was a piece of wood that was the dartboard.
Oh, right.
You had to soak it before you played, so it expanded and trapped the wire. And used to play that in the local pubs.
Oh, right.
That was just a piece of wood.
Yeah.
So it could have been.
Derived from that, yes. The bottom of the butt.
Just the last question. Years ago when we were children, we used to do throwing arrows.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And they used to travel far distance.
They did, yes. You cut a little notch in the shaft,
Yeah,
tie a
well,
piece of string
with a knot in it.
and yeah.
You could launch it quite a distance.
You could, yes. Yeah.
Just going to say.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for all your questions, and thank you for answering them all.
That's a pleasure.
A couple of announcements to make to you. we're obviously preparing our programme for next year, and of course one of the most difficult jobs is looking for speakers. And we're not going to get a speaker like we've just had today. Is he still in the house? Oh yes, I'll keep saying that when he's here. But if you've been anywhere and you've come across speakers or you've heard of speakers, would you let me have the contact details so I can contact them to ask them if they're prepared to speak at our History Society? Okay, that's one thing. And secondly, thank you all who came on the trip to Salford Quays, and all of you that came all seem to have enjoyed it, and I'd like to say thank you very much for the support that you gave me. Okay, thank you for that. I'd also like to tell you the little theatre in Rill. I've been asked to read this notice out for you. It's an archive screening from Rill provided by the National Screen and Sound Archives of Wales as part of the Britain On Film Coast and Sea. It's on Sunday the 17th of September, 2:30 p.m. and at 1:35 p.m. Rill Fishing Fleet. We are pleased to have a first of 2 screenings from the Coastal Film Collection from the Rill, and a proud history of fishing and boat building over many years, and the film will be accompanied by an exhibition of original paintings by the late James Hughes of many of the sailing ships built in the Rill Harbour. And there's also on the second screening from the Britain On Film Coast and Sea is also on the 8th of October, 2 p.m. to 6, Rill Lifeboat Day. Okay, so if you'd all any like to go to that and give them some support, I'm sure that you will. Okay, so that leaves me that. It's okay on that. After all the questions, Robin's not coming. Or has he been? No. So anyway, thank you very much. So we're going to have some tea and the biscuits and whatever going on. Okay, thanks a lot.